journey just feels like a fun way for me to spend an afternoon. And as you'll see, like the title of the presentation really is familiar because it reflects Dr. Decolonial's book, A Decolonial Anti-Racist Transformative Autoethnographic Journey Towards Reconciliation. As a racialized immigrant woman's empowering stories, and this takes some of that and it also talks about my own. And today I want to share why I felt inspired to read her book and how her story weaves through my own life and work and studies. The way I've chosen to share this with you today is by reflecting on why I so often turn to books, the whole book. This is just like a little bit of my library, my anti-racist and decolonial bookshelf. And I'm going to go through some of those first before I get to Dr. Decolonial's book, because it'll make sense as I go along, and why I still turn to books and BIPOC voices to guide me in this work. Before that, importantly, if there's anything I'm certain of now in my life, it's that we're inextricably linked to the land. The land is our lifeblood and our home, our family. As Indigenous writer and scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer beautifully shares with us, is that our relationship with the land is a gift. Every offering and teaching that I've been gifted from Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers reaffirms this every single time. I have a responsibility to honor this relationship with the land. She takes care of me and I will take care of her. As Japola so beautifully also puts in her book, I know that I am as connected to the land as I was to my mother through the umbilical cord, providing me with fresh oxygen, local species of chirping birds, bees, worms, weeds, and flowers. This is not something I was outrightly taught as a child, but it was present in how my father, a first-generation Canadian who tended his gardens with great skill, having learned it from his own childhood growing up on the farm. It was present in my maternal grandfather, who was a skilled hunter and fisher and taught me how to troll a rod up the side of a boat on the lake. It was present in my grandmother and my mother, who nourished me with food and art and pushing me outside to play. I was also not outrightly taught how I came to be on these lands, though. Common amongst, my white settler loved ones, particularly. Sure, I understood I was a descendant of immigrants, but the term settler were not used, definitely not used. Those were my grandparents or my great-great-great-grandparents. That was not me. I was a Canadian. So this became a term that I'm just more recently connected to. My father's families came from Belgium. Flemish was what they spoke at home, and my dad was always proud of where he came from, but he didn't teach me how to speak Flemish. So that's also something I identified when Dr. Decolonial talks about in her book, about the preciousness of the language, and sometimes I wish my dad had. And then on my mother's side, she's proud of her lineage going back to England and Ireland. So eventually my ancestors settled in Manitoba, where my parents met and I was born on Treaty 2 territory, which is on shared territory between the Dakota-Ute, the Anishinaabe, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis, which is some of my nieces and nephews are proud members of. I now live here in Calgary, where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, traditionally known as Mohkinstsis and Blackfoot, Witchuspa to the Stoney Nakoda, and Kutsitsi to the Tsuut'ina. We're on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, where I live right next to, not far from here, and from the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Pond, and Stoney Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, including Nose Hill Métis District 5 and Elbow Métis District 6. And I'm so grateful for all the Indigenous peoples who have taken care of and honored this land for thousands of years. And despite everything, I'm amazed how they endeavor to foster friendship and share abundance with settlers like myself. Now, Dr. Japola begins her book this way, looking at the meaning of land acknowledgements, and it is a good way to begin today. And as she acknowledges, many settlers don't understand or hold relationships with the land. My ancestors did as farmers, and many of them still farm today on that land in Manitoba. But I don't know, or I don't know that I could ever know how reciprocal that relationship was, or if it was simply for subsistence and economic development. What I reflect on is how that land came to be their land. My Belgian family came here shortly after World War I with nothing left in Belgium for them. They were looking for other place to live and to farm. Their priest told them, go to Manitoba. There's land. Nobody's there. And then on my English-Irish side, they came up to Canada from New England into Ontario. Again, offered free land, parcels, free land. So this is something that it's newer information to me, but I have to reconcile with it, and I must. Only I can find out who I am and where I come from and how I came to be here and what that means in a settler colonial state. And then at the panel that Chipola mentioned, Decolonial Disaster Research panel here a couple months ago, it really stuck with me that I wasn't just finding out who I am for myself or my daughter or my loved ones, but I was responsible to find out who I am to begin undoing the harms of colonialism. So importantly, okay, who am I? I'm going to start with who I am not. I am not an expert in decolonization or racism and anti-racism or DEI. I am not a person from Black, Indigenous, or racialized community, and I am not a scholar, at least not yet. But I am here today to talk about, so I'm not here today to talk about theory. I'm not here to talk about any of that. I'm here to talk about what I am an expert on, which is my own journey and my own work and experience. So who am I? These are just some of my identities. I hold many, as we all do, simultaneously. And I held many of these long before becoming a mother. But my primary identities these days are being a mom and being a future ancestor and being a good future ancestor. Like Dr. Chipola, she writes, I dream of gifting my children with a decolonial and just society, and we share in that dream. So I live each day of my life in mind with the world I hope for my daughter and all the world's human and more than human children. She's 4.5. Her name is Lennon, which means dear one. I endeavor to be a good future ancestor, so in part of that journey of recognizing where I've come from, I look inside to who I am, and I must look inside to who I am. As a white, cisgendered, able-bodied, university-educated settler woman with a healthy family, husband, my daughter, my dog, I see myself as a person of much privilege. In the earliest years of my life, growing up in Manitoba, my mom was single with 4 kids, and around 8 or 9, we moved to a smaller town in Manitoba, where I saw us living a regular middle-class life. I never felt without. All my basic and material needs were met. With that, I do live with complex trauma from my childhood that rooted me in a deep dysregulation. For much of my life, I felt that I didn't belong or deserve love. This only began to shift finding community and ecologically centered folks while recovering from my time working in the oil and gas industry. And I went down a long road of trying to figure out where I was supposed to be. It took an even larger shift when I read this book, What My Bones Know, by Stephanie Fu. I found parallels in our lives, but space for learning as well, as she discusses racism in the context of the impact on mental health, particularly by exploring how systemic oppression and intergenerational trauma, including racism, can contribute to complex PSD. So it was incredibly healing to find somebody who had something to relate to, and then also eye-opening because I had a lot to learn. So I'm blessed now to have found myself part of many communities which have nurtured my personal sense of belonging and kindled my drive to engage with belonging in fractals or never-ending patterns that are self-similar, and that the belonging to ourselves reverberates through our belonging to community and society and the earth. This is very much inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown, whose book on emergent strategy is like just medicine. She talks a lot about fractals and that reverberation of what we do at the local or at the small individually or within our communities makes that difference out in society, because those patterns repeat themselves. If we are good to ourselves and our neighbors, that reflects out. Which brings me to my curiosity of how we may live in community with the land so that we can heal together. My approach to healing myself came alongside my relationship with community and the land. And this holistic approach is one I feel we desperately need. Robin Wall Kimmerer, also just the best medicine, speaks to this a lot in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Every page is medicine for the soul, honestly. And I continue to weave my European farmer settler roots and indigenous ways of knowing and learning and letting go that the land belongs to us, but that we belong to the land. And embracing how we can collectively, as settlers and indigenous folks and newcomers, can come together to heal together. So I'm now part of a regenerative community through activities like bioregional organizing, community gardening, and I live it through my studies, my work, and my personal experiences, which I will share a little bit more about now. And I'm going to keep doing that through books for a little bit. So I completed my BA in Environment and Urban Sustainability at TMU, where I took a course on Indigenous politics, and there it really opened my eyes to the systemic barriers faced by Indigenous peoples. And another course I took was on Canadian immigration, and this gave me a truly profound experience. I got to interview a friend, a close friend, who's now expecting twins. I just learned. She came to Canada from India when she was very young with her parents. And this was the first time I really truly listened to an immigrant and to a racialized settler in any kind of capacity. And it really shaped how I learned to listen and understand privilege and power. And I'm just so grateful that she sat with me and opened up to me. And it really showed me the importance of taking serious some of these assignments that we get in school, and what a gift they are. I'm now, as shared, pursuing a master's in community development at the University of Victoria, where my thesis work has grown out of numerous influences. I am still sort of figuring it out, but I'm narrowing in on climate disaster and displacement, centering the more than human world, but grounded in frameworks and methods that are rooted in BIPOC wisdom. That's what's leading us. So intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw so beautifully gave us, decolonial planetary health being that the health of us is inextricably linked to the health of the planet, and community-based participatory research, which is all about empowerment and inclusion in the research process. I also have a growing curiosity for two-eyed seeing, which isn't up here, and three-eyed seeing, and I love it. I just still haven't figured out how to weave that into my work yet. But it's there. Elder Albert Marshall and two-eyed seeing start there. It's amazing. Again, books have been central in this journey. One important one that was just introduced to me is Talking Up to the White Woman. This is an Australian woman who writes in here, Eileen Morton Robinson. I haven't read the whole text. Yeah, that's okay. I haven't read the whole text. I've read parts for school. But even the parts I've read really complements the works of Bell Hooks and Layla Syed, whose work centers on the intersection of race, class, privilege, and gender to dismantle systems of oppression. So Talking Up to the White Woman is an Indigenous critique of mainstream feminism. It highlights how white feminism often centers white women while marginalizing Indigenous voices, making visible the power and the privilege that white women have in academia and in society. So once this term is over, I hope to rise it to the top, because as you probably have learned there sometimes can be less time to do the fun reading, and for me this is fun reading. So all of these experiences, courses, interviews, readings, writings shaped how I understand my responsibilities as a researcher and a community practitioner and a learner. They remind me how to center BIPOC knowledge and listen deeply and act with care and humility. In my work, I worked at the BC Association of Farmers Markets. It's a member association that supports farmers markets across BC. I worked there a few years back, and our team felt compelled after George Floyd's murder, like so many, to look closely at our work and ourselves to see if we were really addressing racism and oppression in the farmers market world in BC, and we realized that training was absolutely essential. We really needed to start a lot from within, just like myself, starting within. There was a lot of concern about tokenism. Especially our board was very concerned that that this was just tokenistic, and we had to do a lot of sitting in meetings, and the discussion became, it's tokenistic if you make it tokenistic. If you just have the trainings and then do nothing with it, that makes it tokenistic. And so it became very important that we did something with it. And I remember how pivotal this was for me personally, because those of us advocating for the work we didn't know what we were doing. This was new to us. But we had to confront structural racism, which even the meetings we had with the board and the other staff, it was right there that the structural racism was that, well, it's not my responsibility. What can we do about it? Does it matter in farmers markets? Of course it does, it matters everywhere. But we did navigate our way through that, and it was a lot of process of unlearning and relearning. A big resource that guided me at this time, I took an entire course, and this was a workbook, Decolonize First, a liberating guide and workbook for peeling back the layers of neocolonialism. This is Tatalia Nahani. They've got a lot of resources, even new stuff that I'm seeing come out about decolonizing your work, which applies to life, applies to studies. And it's a powerful book that prompts and exercises. There's lots of resources, but it helps examine the condition of responses and build emotional and intellectual strength. And I really want to stress the emotional strength. It takes a lot. And shift from colonial defaults to critical consciousness. And it provides a lot of opportunity for personal reflection. So like with the farmers markets, Chipola mentioned working at the Bosch Community Association, where I was a community development coordinator. And we went through the exact same things, the exact same internal processes of working with staff and board, and noticing that trying to do things with the community was very much, there were a lot of the biggest barriers were what was going inside internally with the staff and the board. It became critical that we addressed the structural racism, the structural issues that we had to get the buy-in and to get the support that I needed to be able to execute the programs. And helping the board understand the why. But we did get there, and there were incremental moves towards anti-racism and decolonization, and I have to admit I burned out, and that happens. But I didn't always have the tools and support I needed. So over time I realized that again, community was necessary, and it was the gift I could give myself. We nurtured and held each other accountable and turned towards building community around the work itself, not just for the community. And then this work also extends into other projects I've been a part of, like a Tiny Forest Initiative, which I'll talk about in a minute, and community gardens, and then where I work at Tapestry Collective Co-op, where I'm a consultant. We focus on program analysis, systems level analysis, community research, most recently working on community safety and well-being with the City of Edmonton. Emergent strategy, again, really comes up, especially when you're doing systems level change. Again, thinking about fractals and that everything is related amongst the levels. And seeing those patterns and patterns of belonging ripple out through communities and society and the environment. And ultimately this work is ongoing, challenging, deeply collective, but it's taught me that transformation requires a lot of patience, reflection, and commitment to both personal and systemic change. They go hand in hand. So finally in my life, before I get to explore this book more deeply, are the ways that I engage with community and learning beyond work and studies. And a pivotal influence for me was a community book club. And it was reading Me and White Supremacy, which is a book and also a workbook. It is something that we sat together as white folks and talked a lot about what was going on at the time. Again, this was the same time after George Floyd's murder. But it was really transformative because it helped me again see the systems of oppression, but also importantly what this book gives me was like what I can do with it. Not just sitting in it, but what to do going forward. And it was through her book that I fully embraced the idea of being a future ancestor. The second line of the book cover is "Combat racism, change the world, and become a good ancestor." And it's for everybody of every background. And not just for me, like for my own child, but for the children of all relations, human and more than human. I began to see how my actions and words and choices ripple outward, and how community spaces like the book club are a place to practice accountability and reflection and grow together. And this is where the connection between personal reflection and collective learning and responsibilities of being a good ancestor really started to crystallize for me. Of course, conferences and workshops are also spaces which allow me to connect with peers and mentors and practitioners. They're opportunities to learn and figure out how the work or my ideas fit into the broader movements around equity and decolonization. And there's spaces again to build community around the work for yourself. So I really encourage you to take every opportunity you have, apply for funding where you can to go to conferences and workshops. I know it certainly made a big difference for me. And then same with volunteering and giving back, whether it's supporting a local organization or contributing to community initiatives. I know time can be hard, especially as a student. As a new mom, I think I went 3 years without volunteering, but I missed it. And there's something to be said about like showing up and being present and giving to the collective well-being of our neighbors. So community building isn't always formal, and it happens in small, everyday moments. So conversations around the dinner table and the way I approach raising my daughter are central to how I enact the values that I care about, teaching her empathy and care and justice and connection. And it's also in the books that I bring to her and we pick out at the library. So these are daily practices, taking things from the page and modeling what it means to be a good future ancestor. So as you've seen, books have always been an essential part of my journey. I turn to them often and with great care. I usually have large stacks of them on the side of my desk and all over the house. People take their time to tell us their stories. And it's my responsibility to listen to BIPOC voices, especially doing community work and research. Like the land, books are gifts. And these gifts are to be honored, and I endeavor to honor those gifts, not just by listening, but by paying attention to what their words are calling upon me to move towards and bring out into the world. So opening a book like Dr. Tripola's book is a space where our anti-racism and decolonial journeys met, mine and hers. it was such a blessing to meet her at this point in my journey, and kismet, as some might say. At this point, I've been going deeper into decolonial planetary health frameworks through school and decolonial anti-racism frameworks through my consulting work. And I was reminded of how much I've learned on my journey doing this, putting this together. I was like, oh wow, I've learned a lot. I'm doing things. But then I'm also reminded of how much I'm not doing and how much I don't know, and why it's so important to just keep going. So I think most importantly, curiosity and humility have served me well on the journey. Curiosity done respectfully with humility breaks down barriers, it builds bridges, but it also sets gentle boundaries for ourselves, all of which are important in social and environmental justice work and community work. I was driven a lot by curiosity to read Chipola's book. I was actually doing a couple of assignments and realized I was referencing her and her husband's work in my papers. I was doing it all up, and then I was going back and I was like, wait a minute, they live right next door. Which was wild to me. I was like, wait a minute, hold the phone, what's going on? Why were we put next to each other? But just like, how lucky am I? I get to walk over and just be like, let's have a conversation. Let's work together. So beyond like the curiosity of just what exactly was autoethnographic work, I'd never heard of it. But who is my neighbor? And what is she writing about? And what will affirm what I understand of anti-racism and decolonization, and what will challenge me? And I really don't want the first question to get lost, because I've shared books are very important to my growth and help shape what I can offer the world, but here is my neighbor who's offered something. She's right next door. And how like ignorant of me would it be, or irresponsible of me, to not heed what she's saying, to not go, hey, I want to learn about that, and I want to learn about you. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to honor and celebrate her work and weave it into my own journey and my work. It's a gift. It's also a responsibility. It reminded me to consider what else I might not know of my neighbors, all my neighbors, and to be respectfully curious about who they are, and to be gentle with strangers whose journeys I do not know. So I invite you to consider, what do you know of your neighbors, and how might you bridge or weave into each other's stories? For I know that by doing so, I've been opened up to a lot of abundance. I was opened up to so many more ideas and theories and ways of knowing and seeing about racism and colonialism and many, many other isms that show up in my life, and how I can continually reimagine and engage with them. These are just a few. So multiculturalism and immigrant newcomer experiences, responsibility, minorities within minorities or intersecting forms of oppression, intersectionality, gentle power, learning, unlearning, relearning, more than human relations, community and relationships as decolonial and anti-racist practice, gifts of wisdom and indigenous teachings, here to show us the way, informal spaces as places of connection and practice, and power of sharing stories. So I'm only going to go into 3 of these. I will not go into all of these. Chipola describes the many aspects of community garden space that build on this as a space of empowerment and bridge building, healing, learning, land-based education, Indigenous land-based wisdom, art-based decolonial learning, and community solidarity. And we do connect on that very key aspect or idea that the community garden and other informal spaces particularly directly connect us to the land and to each other as places of decolonial anti-racist practice. Now, I had been part of community gardening for many years, and I never saw it as that space. Not intentionally. And now I see it differently because of this work. As she shares, the Community Garden Project has provided a powerful way of building bridges among Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. It connects with neighborhoods, enriches experiences, and inspires us to learn about new ways of knowing through co-learning and relearning together. So it makes me think of an example of a project I was very honored to be a part of. When I was working with the Bosch Community Association, a white settler resident approached us with the idea of constructing a tiny forest rooted in and led by Indigenous land-based wisdom and designed in the shape of a medicine wheel. How familiar are we with medicine wheels? Do folks know what they are? See some, okay. So medicine wheel is an ancient Indigenous symbol used to transfer teaching about nature's cycles, stages of life, self-care, and the sacred medicines. They are not the same for every Indigenous nation or community. They are different. But the oldest known medicine wheel on Turtle Island is estimated to be about 5,500 years old and located near Majorville Carn in Alberta. And within the medicine wheel circle, some of the plants that you see here have been selected to reflect the colors of the 4 quadrants. So for many, it could be these are the 4 directions or the 4 sacred medicines, and again, many other things. So the resident wanted the tiny forest. This is about the size of maybe this room. It's pretty small. It's built next to the community garden that we had just built. The idea was to have it in the shape of the medicine wheel, which you can see was done here. Now, it was seen, I was just like, great, this is an amazing opportunity for us to build those bridges and belonging, especially with the Indigenous community. Bonas has a higher Indigenous population compared to the rest of Calgary, and to connect those Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And it really moved me, but I really lacked confidence as well. I was so worried about getting it wrong. And what was happening was where that personal journey was also meeting the work journey. I was doing a lot of healing from my own complex trauma that I found was necessary for me to find the confidence that it was okay that I didn't get it right, that I was not going to get everything right. And I've heard this through my work as well, that Indigenous folks within working with cities or communities or organizations find, especially with their white settler colleagues, that this seems to stop people from doing things, from taking what they're learning and enacting on it in their work. And I realized that was what was happening to me there. So I had some stuff to heal on my own. I had to do that work to find the confidence that I didn't have to get everything right. What was mattering was that I was doing it, and I was attempting and trying to do it in a good way, that would be noticed. And inviting the feedback of what I wasn't getting right. Managing a project like this, a community space, community garden, another kind of community garden, really demanded embracing like insecurities and employing that curiosity again. Alongside that personal growth, I leaned into the project with a lot of humility and heart, and did a lot of consulting with my executive director, doing blanket exercises, doing sharing circles and learning from elders, and the books, like going back to the books and the guides that have been teaching me what to do. It was highly welcomed by the community, actually. The design, people were loving it. An Indigenous resident shared we had an Indigenous community consultation before, making sure we're doing it in a good way. And something that made it all worth it was an Indigenous resident said, I've lived down the road from the community association for, I think she said 20 years, and she had never been there. And she lived just down the road. This was the first time she felt seen by the community and by the community association. And that just goes to show that this isn't tokenistic, right? It's important that we embrace symbols and we embrace the culture and we represent it, because it does help bring people in. We also had a resident who was a volunteer in the community garden. The community garden was going to help take care of this, who felt vehemently against this. They said there's no place for a medicine wheel or these kinds of cultural symbols at a community center. And it was extraordinarily difficult. How do we manage this? I was really taken aback. We did a lot of going back and forth, meetings, and then we also had a consultation with the Indigenous folks on our team that were working on this. And this person used really offensive and denigrating language, which, again, this was a new experience for me, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this. It was awful. It was racist, and it really showed me that even though I thought we had prepared properly and that we were being culturally sensitive to how we were going about it, it wasn't enough. We needed to make sure that our volunteers had proper training beforehand, that there were written commitments about what we do, and that if you're not willing to engage in this way, maybe this isn't the place for you. So we then developed those things, right? So it was very hard learning, because I should have put our Indigenous project team members first.
Was it only one person?
It was one very loud vocal person who was trying to work up the rest of the community that this wasn't right. And I mean, obviously you see, this is it now blooming when I went to the elder led the blessing to name it. And it was so wonderful because it was there. My daughter was gifted a Blackfoot named Anitsipitsi, which means black, beautiful bird. And that was Elder Dr. Clarence Wolfleg who gave her that name. And everything, just felt amazing. It was like, I'm so glad we stuck with it, despite the challenges. But these were like my formative experiences in cross-cultural planning and community building that, and so again, just like going back to like, don't let getting it wrong stop you from moving forward. Just make sure you build community around the work itself, for yourself, and that will hold you up. And like when you make mistakes, humbly respond with humility and curiosity as you work your way through it. Importantly, this was also very powerful for me, the second theme, which is this critical view of multiculturalism. So, Triple shares, while multiculturalism has opened, I've got a different one here, but anyways. The complicated multicultural policy hides the fundamental problems facing Indigenous and racialized newcomer community groups. I did not come to this country simply to entertain white folks. I have a rich culture, heritage, and knowledge that needs to be respected, valued, and represented as an art, not entertainment for a poorly educated audience. Oof. Let me tell you, that's hard to like read for me. And there's some of this critique throughout the book. And I was like, let me sit with this. What does this mean? We live in this, we're the fabric or whatever. The US is the melting pot. We're the like beautiful multicultural blanket. This was like, was the narrative I grew up with in the 90s. And I mean, the 90s was a really formative time for Canadian identity. It was being reimagined in real time, shaped by political tensions between Quebec, Indigenous people. A scheduled test. All right, we're okay. And the rest of the country, and there were lots of global shifts and migrations. I don't want to assume anything about people's age, but there was also a big, huge I Am Canadian push that came out around 2000. Lots of commercials. Molson Canadian got on board. This was a big thing at this time, Canadian identity. So, and along with that, it was that, you can come to Canada and still be yourself. We're not going to make you assume a language. We're not going to make you assume a culture. But I realize now, especially through reading this, that that story was a very sanitized story that I had learned as a younger person, and that multiculturalism as a point of national pride was a point of national pride, and rather than like a system that obscures ongoing inequities. And so I can see now I'm guilty of participating in that narrative. I didn't question it a whole lot. I've always, appreciated cultural expression, but I didn't always take the time to understand it. And appreciation at a distance, is not the same as respect. And respect requires engagement, curiosity, humility, but also that willingness to be transformed when it is being offered to you. Not just to digest it, but to transform yourself. And one example that stands out is I've had the privilege of listening to Dr. Tupola play her harmonium and sing on a few occasions. And each time she shares the story of the instruments, her art, the lineage, and in those moments, I felt a connection way beyond performance. And I feel very lucky to have had that. And I also remembered earlier in my life how I would grow impatient when Indigenous folks or BIPOC folks were sharing their art and needed to share this whole story, and now I see that the stories, so the context, the meaning, the land, the ancestors is not separate from the art, but it is the art. And as my understanding deepens, I see more clearly the challenges BIPOC and diasporic artists face. So lack of opportunity and recognition, inadequate funding, and institutional support, and the pressure to perform. And so all this expanded my heart and opened my mind, and it's my responsibility again to honor the fullness of what is being shared rather than simply observing it. Which brings me to my final theme. Stories. The power of sharing stories. We hear this a lot, but that's because it's so true. They open our minds and our hearts, and our souls, like they connect us with one another. Transnational exchanges about sustaining communities and ecosystems are at the core of decolonization, reconciliation, and mutual empowerment, and becoming and belongingness. We need to start the journey together toward healing as a community by developing a passion for learning about each other, and stories is how we do that. That's how we learn about each other. So I go back to why I read this book on how our journeys became one. At times it was painful to hear the discrimination that my neighbor and friend has experienced and does experience. So I can only imagine how painful it must have been for her to uproot that from within herself. It's an act of courage to look at it, to look at your life and to look at what you're experiencing, and then to do it through this very sort of structured academic way was mind-boggling to me. It's amazing, and it's even braver still. It was also a joyful experience presented, and to think differently about all these topics, and move me more towards an anti-racist and decolonial future. So with that, I'll offer a couple last reflections. And I just lost my, here we go. That community building is not equal. And a reminder that to reflect on some of this, that these takeaways are mine. They're not across everybody. And they might be different for you. So I realized how much of my own story, the one I've been sharing with you today, is grounded in both empowerment and community building. The threads have been woven throughout the presentation, sometimes subtly and sometimes intentionally. Through Dr. Tupola's experiences, what I learned and have come to understand is how community building looks and feels very different for newcomers, immigrants, and BIPOC communities than it does for someone like myself, a white settler. Many BIPOC individuals and communities face structural, social, emotional barriers that deeply shape where, how, and whether a community can be formed. The barriers that came through in her book, systemic racism, woven into institutions and everyday interactions, lack of safe, culturally grounded spaces, underfunding or limited resources for community-led initiatives, tokenism and cultural extraction, exhaustion and emotional labor, and unpaid labor often expected or demanded, where BIPOC members and women are relied on to educate or organize or diversify spaces. So for many BIPOC communities, again, from what I've learned and not my own experience, community building isn't about just connection. It can be about safety and healing and cultural continuity and resisting systems that have marginalized them. Community becomes a lifeline, a site of shared resilience and collective power. For different reasons, I can understand that community is a lifeline, as I shared earlier. So again, we connect on that. And that's something about community, is like we don't arrive at it all from the same paths, but there's something that grounds us there together. So as a white settler, I recognize I often enter community spaces with automatic belonging and access and credibility. Privileges not universally experienced. And understanding this shapes how I approach community work with humility and a commitment to listening first, and with an awareness of when I step back and make space and to offer support instead of offering direction. And that community building is empowering. It really is. I love it. I'm actually more of an introvert than I am an extrovert. Community gives me the ability to be able to still be a part of something while not always necessarily leading things, but still contributing. Every part and every person matters. So after sitting with these realities and the weight of the barriers many BIPOC folks face, like Chipol, I found myself returning to my own relationship with community building. Not as a comparison, but as a recognition of why it's been so central to my learning. Even with the very different conditions that shape our experiences, I've realized that empowerment and community building have been foundational threads in my own story. For me, empowerment emerges through connection to myself, to the land, to my family and my loved ones, and to the communities, and to the voices and teachings that have shaped my journey. It grows through healing, shared learning, and stepping into responsibility with humility. And this is where the continuity becomes clear. So community building is empowering because it is collective. Even when shaped by vast different realities, community remains a place of possibility. We heal together and we imagine better futures together. And these are relationships where I feel most grounded and most accountable and most connected to the world I hope to shape as a mom and a future ancestor. And I felt deep resonance with Chipola's community work in gardens, on the radio, which I didn't talk about, and through art. There's so much good stuff in there. So when I think about who's guided me on my own anti-racist and decolonial journey, who has shaped my learning and challenged my assumptions and expanded my sense of responsibility, the answer is clear. It is women, BIPOC women. Women like the ones in these books and Dr. Chipola, whose brilliance and courage and generosity have continually and generously offered me guidance. What they share is not just insights, again, they are gifts. Gifts of knowledge, experience, lived truth, and rooted wisdom. Gifts offered in the face of systems that so often demand their unpaid labor and emotional labor and cultural labor. These offerings are not owed to me or to any of us. And so the question becomes what I do with these gifts. My responsibility is to listen deeply first, to learn humbly and act meaningfully, and to ensure that the guidance I receive becomes material in the world. So in my choices, how I raise my daughter, my relationships, my commitments, and the communities I build. Like the land itself, their words are a gift, and I'm profoundly grateful that Dr. Chipola's journey and mine cross paths, and that all of you are now part of this shared moment of learning and reflection and possibility. It's why I recommend reading her whole book. Her words take an important critical approach and teach us about unseen experiences and call us toward unearthing and nurturing empowerment, relationships with the land, community building, and decolonization. As she shares, empowerment is embedded in and earned through community, in commitments to generosity of spirit not recognized by the Western system. That generosity needs to be admitted and values to create sustainable futures for all. And necessary to this is the reconnection with the land that can help us to reclaim our cultural identities, histories, cultural teachings, languages, and artistic expressions. And respect for one another's rooted knowledges only helps us to know who we are and what our responsibilities are in this new Indigenous land. These rooted knowledges can help us to decolonize our minds, religions, languages, cultures, identities, and rootless upbringings. So I invite you all to think about your own journey. You all have the same journey. We're just all on different parts of that journey or different paths on that journey. And think about the teachers in your life and the books that have guided you and what responsibilities that their teachings call you into, and how you can respond with care and accountability and love and courage. And that keep going back to them. Don't let them sit on your shelf. Take them to a lecture down the road from you. And that's all I have for today, so thank you so much.